Welcome to Axios House. I hope you have had a great Davos week so far. We're not done yet. We got to power through a few more days, all of us, early mornings, long nights. I'm having a great time. I'm Sarah Kehalani-Gu. I'm the editor-in-chief of Axios. I welcome you to Axios House. We're about to have a really great conversation this morning, a topic I'm really interested in personally. This is our fourth day of programming. We've got tomorrow is our last day. Hope you've been enjoying the events here. There's more to come. Our goal here is to have conversations that matter in smart brevity. And as a reminder, please follow along if you want to keep the conversation going on social media. We're using the hashtag Axios Events. We've got an exciting lineup of guests this morning. And today's topic is very timely. It's on the future of DEI in the workplace. We're calling it Finding a Voice, DEI's corporate role. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our first guest. She's the EVP and Chief People Policy and Purpose Officer at Cisco, Fran Katsoudas. Welcome. Welcome. Have a seat. Thank you. Wonderful. All right. So really timely topic, DEI. I think that we've all followed the news. It seems like now people are confused about DEI. The U.S. Supreme Court came out with its decision affecting universities on affirmative action. And now I think we've written several stories about how companies are uncertain now the way forward. So I'd love to hear from you about how you're thinking about DEI in this time. It was really certain we had really a strong moment after, in the United States in particular, after George Floyd was killed in 2020, and here we are 4 years later. So tell us about the Cisco approach.
Thank you so much. I do think this conversation is so important for us. When I think about DEI, and I'll start with Cisco, but I think this is broader, what I see at this moment is transformation. I see evolution. I do not see eradication. And I hate the fact that in some cases we're having to go back to some of the stats that remind us around why we're having this conversation. But maybe we use this moment, and maybe now, given we have more data and insights, we tell the story in a different way. But again, if you think about it, and I'll just use Deloitte as an example, they recently put out a study that said that when you have a diverse workforce, you are 2 times more likely to have better financial results, 3 times more likely to have creativity, productivity. I think we know this to be the case. And so at Cisco, our approach is to really lean into what makes us better. We talk about a concept called full spectrum of diversity, and we have now for about 6 or 7 years. And the reason for that is I realized one day I was on stage and I was talking about diversity, and there were women looking at me, and what I realized afterwards was that women of color were looking at me and they were saying, "Are you talking about us?" And men were saying, "Well, why aren't you talking about us?" And there's this element where we all belong. And so when we talk about the full spectrum of diversity, we talk about age, race, ethnicity, orientation, identity, veteran status, you name it, because we all belong. And so that's the approach that we've taken. I would say that for us, we run the same programs that we did before. We will continue to run them. They make us better as a company. We owe that to, I think, the community and to our customers as well.
And I noticed that in 2020, Cisco committed, I think, $300 million over 5 years, in particular on social justice. What is the future of that? And tell us about why you decided to do that. And is that something, like, I think a lot of companies are now maybe second guessing whether they should be involved in something like social justice. We're in a political presidential year, of course, and now things seem more fraught for them.
Yeah, it was $350 million,
Okay.
and it was so important for us because as companies, where you invest signals what you care about and what's important. I will tell you, we learned a lot, and along the journey, something that we kept asking ourselves is, where can we have the biggest impact? Our strengths as a company, we connect people. That's our technology. It's what we do, and so we learned that in one example, connecting the talent from an HBCU perspective to companies across the U.S. That's a strength that we have. We could help all of the HBCUs with their technology as well. We saw that during COVID, organizations, universities that were not connected did not fare well. And so I think we refined how we approached it. I will tell you that on a quarterly basis, our executive leadership team that reports into the CEO, we review our social justice actions, our initiatives, our progress. At any given moment, we know what is green, yellow, red. We're largely green, which I'm very proud of, and it's important work that I think drives tremendous business results as well.
And when you think about DEI, most people think about in terms of hiring, right?
Yes.
In terms of ensuring that you have a diverse pool of candidates, for example, as a basic start. But as we all seen in the tech space in particular, it's been hit by layoffs. Cisco's had to do layoffs like a lot of other tech companies. How do you manage that? How do you manage DEI when you're in the reverse situation where you need to shrink your staff? And how do you do so with DEI in mind in that direction?
It's such a hard conversation, and I think many of us are dealing with, like, how do you do this in a way that's authentic to who you are? And that's what we focus on. At Cisco, our purpose is to power an inclusive future for all. And we look at that internally, we look at that externally as well. And so when we go through a restructuring, what we try and do is put our people first. And what that means is that we work really, really hard to place people in other roles. We assign recruiters to anyone who's been impacted so that they can look for work inside the company, outside of the company. We have direct conversations with people. One of the things that hurts me is when people find out via email. I think that is so incredibly tough. And so we do our best to really support our people. We also really look at who are we impacting. Are we being thoughtful about that as well? And so at the end of the day, I would say, like everything else, we try to put our people first and navigate in a way with open communication and transparency.
And that's, I mean, I imagine that it's challenging. Cisco has like 86,000 employees, and it's hard to imagine how to do that at scale effectively. Not only that, but also the culture that you're trying to maintain at that scale. How do you do that?
You know, two ways. I think the first is you have to do it through your leadership. So when you're present in over 100 countries, you know that you can't control things from the center, right? And so you have to have leaders that understand that their role is to take care of their people. And it was probably about 8 years ago, as our CEO came in, one of the things that he cares a ton about is this concept of servant leadership. And so I'm in service of my team and not the reverse. And I think when leaders understand that their performance is based on how they treat people, how they ensure that people have good careers, I think it changes the dynamic. The other thing that I would say is one of the philosophies that we have is around conscious culture. And so what that means is that every single person in the company owns the culture as much as I do or anyone else from a C-suite perspective. And in a conscious culture, if you see something wrong, you say something, and that you know that you're supported in that as well. And I think that ownership has truly changed the company.
That's fascinating. I like that word. I think that's an important phrase to reiterate and keep everybody on the same page. And then I guess when you think about how you see other companies, DEI, talk about DEI, it seems very vague, and it does seem like it needs more specifics. That is different company to company or organization to organization. How do you think it's evolving? You mentioned earlier about making sure everyone feels part of it and understands it. What's been most effective, I guess, to translate that within Cisco?
Yeah, I look back around 8 or 9 years, and I remember there were so many activities, there were so many efforts, people were doing a ton in the space, but the data didn't show the progress. And so I'm a big believer that you have to look at your numbers, you need to share your numbers, you need to talk about what's working and not working. I think we had situations where we were doing better from a hiring perspective, but then from a retention perspective, we had a challenge. And so what you have to look at is, how are you doing on all elements from a talent management perspective? I do believe that you have to engage your people. I do think that the best ideas that we have come from our folks as well. And then the last thing that I would say is, there are programs that we have at Cisco where I know if someone goes through the program, they have higher promotion velocity and higher level of retention. that's something that we're going to bet on big. And then we see others where we don't have that impact, and that's why I think there's a ton of evolution in the work that we're doing.
Retention is an important point. What specifically can you do on that side to ensure that the people you're hiring are happy, they're thriving, they have opportunities to grow, et cetera, understand the culture, feel part of it?
Yeah, I think there's probably 3 or 4 things that really stand out. So the first is people have to believe in the purpose of the company. And I do think that nowadays when I look at the candidates that are interviewing with us, let me tell you, they know a ton about us, and they go through our purpose report. We've seen the number of views on our purpose report increase like 3x, and these are candidates that are checking us out. So the first thing is, I think there has to be something that we believe in that brings us together, and for us, it's this inclusive future. The second thing is people want to have meaningful careers, and we all define that in different ways. And so having the ability to have that type of career, I think, is important. The next thing is you have to have a relationship with your leader, and you have to feel like your leader provides you attention on a regular basis. And there's all sorts of interesting things right now around when your leader makes eye contact with you in a meeting, that has an impact on how you feel connected to your team, to your company. And so I would say that's the third thing. And then the last thing, which is super important, is your team. And the relationship that you have with your team is really how you see the company. And so I think those are the big areas that truly drive retention.
Have you seen any just anecdotal evidence or otherwise? You mentioned eye contact. That's harder when not everyone's in the office or on a Zoom. So how does that play into that relationship?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, eye contact via like a WebEx meeting, it's a little bit different, right? Yeah, I had to say WebEx. In fact, let the record show, I didn't say that for like 13 minutes. There's other factors that are really fascinating. So another one is ask your people, do they have a best friend within the organization? What we found is when someone says they actually have a BFF within the company, that also impacts their retention. I do think that now in this virtual world, we have to make more of an impact. And so if it's not the eye contact, it's probably just the call that says, how are you doing? How's the family? Do you need anything? Are you okay? I think these are the things that reestablish the connection that we need.
Yes, work best friend. We talk about that at Axios too. Who else does that? The Gallup thing? Yeah, okay. All right. I know everyone, most people, they either roll their eyes or they get excited. They're like, oh yeah.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so let's bring this conversation back to kind of where we started. So thinking about like that difficult spot in this political year and DEI, ESG, I'd throw in there too. A lot of companies more cautious. Some of them have revamped their programs. Some of them have quietly just stopped talking about them. So what's your smart brevity advice to companies worried about this space, worried about how to talk about it, how to talk to their employees about it, how to talk to the public about it? I'd love your advice to them.
Yeah, so what I would say is focus on the work, focus on your company. When you do that, it guides you to continue to invest in diversity and inclusion. And I don't think that's something that we should shy away from. And again, if we think about our work, I don't think there's anyone who would fault having a program that helps people that are early in career learn and develop, helping women get established, helping your African American Black community, helping your veterans, right? And so I think we have to lean into that. Remember to your customers, sometimes that helps a lot. So as an example, when we look at Cisco's largest customers, like the top 100, about 78% of them actually have ESG goals that they report on. And so that then can allow us to lean in and to be bold because we know our customers are there. We know that we can support them. And guess what? That number is higher from a DEI perspective. When I talk to my peers in the industry, we do talk about the fact that we're being thoughtful about our language. And I think that's okay. We're not changing the work. We're being thoughtful about our language. But I think it's something where I think all of us understand that at this moment, we need to continue to push to make progress. We need to do right by the work, and that really anchors us in diversity and inclusion.
We'll have to leave it there. Great to hear from you from the Cisco perspective, Fran Katsoudas. of Cisco. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you. And next up, Nick Johnston, our publisher.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. This is a great early morning crowd in the middle of Davos week. We are in the thick of our programming here at Axios House. A packed schedule of events this afternoon. Make sure to check online or grab me. After this, I'll tell you all the exciting things coming. And of course, none of the conversations that we're having this week at Axios House would be possible without our partners. So hugely grateful to the W.K. Kellogg Foundation for making today's conversation possible. And I'm very excited to welcome for a view from the top conversation up to Axios House stage, Carla Thompson-Payton, the Foundation's Vice President of Program Strategy. Carla, welcome. So I thought that prior conversation was excellent as far as scene setting, the challenges, opportunities that we face in DEI. So give me your perspective in a big picture. Why are you here? Why is the W.K. Kellogg Foundation engaging on this, and why is it so important?
So the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, we've been in existence since 1930. And when Will Keith Kellogg started the foundations, he said, do what you will with the money, as long as it focuses on the health, well-being, and happiness of children, regardless of race, creed, religion, gender. And we've taken that seriously. And all of our work really centers around how can we create communities where young children thrive and have a future. In 2007, our board said, you are going to become an anti-racist organization. And so everything that we do is grounded within what we call the Kellogg DNA of racial equity, community engagement, and leadership. Because without those three approaches, we don't feel that we can actually achieve the results that we want for children. And so in 2019, before the pandemic, before George Floyd, our investment team was going out talking to all of our money managers around our corpus. And they kept coming back to the team and saying, can you talk to us about how you use your approaches? What are you doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion? Can you give us a toolkit to help us figure out how to build capacity within our corporations? Because we see the benefits that you are having as an organization. We want the same. And so expanding equity started. And that is how we've entered into this space.
This is not a new thing. You've traced an arc as an organization that stretches years and years and years. So let's pull it into the moment now. Why now?
Why now? Why not? That's what we say all the time. We want to work in places. We want our communities to have access to resources and opportunities. And we recognize that as the world diversifies and as we have greater recognition of the diversity that everyone can bring to the table, that we don't want to leave opportunity on the table or on the floor. We know that if we don't think about how we have pipelines of people who historically have not been able to access resources and opportunities, that by 2050, we would have left $8 trillion on the table, and we would have been lacking in innovation that we need in order to create the world that we want. And so Davos is a great opportunity. My first time. No one warned me. That's all I have to say.
I tried. I told you it was cold.
And so for us, it's why not have this conversation? If Davos is focusing on trust, how do you get to real diversity, equity, and inclusion without trust? And so this is why we brought this message here.
And then speaking of Davos, what do we love at Davos? We love data.
Yes.
And you brought some. So dig in a little bit and share. These are floating around the room today. Dig in a little bit some of the takeaways.
Yeah. So we've had 100 Fortune 500 companies participate in expanding equity. Over 600 people going through our core training in 10 sectors and industries. What we've learned are the three things that every single one of these corporations has focused on. Leadership at all levels. Working on diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a solo enterprise. Your board needs to be signed on and championing it. Your C-suite needs to be championing it. All your managers and hiring managers need to be practicing it, and your employees need to understand the value proposition. That's number one. Number two, it's not just about the numbers. It's not just about how many people you can bring into your organization and retain. No one wants to be the only. No one wants to be one of the few. It's about inclusion and belonging. and really focusing on the belonging aspect, because that is where you see the sweet spot of innovation. That's where you see companies thriving. And the 100 companies that we worked with, 95% of them are focused on belonging, creating opportunities within their corporation for sponsorship. Mentorship is good, sponsorship is even better. Creating networks and collaborative opportunities, providing new ways for them to engage in the business at hand. That's what we see. And then we also recognize it's not one size fits all. No one corporation is doing something that someone else is doing. Now, the network talks about the practices that they're doing, but it's not one size fits all. And we encourage folks to say, figure out your why, and then figure out the how, because the how is even more important than the why. And so those are the 3 lessons that you all can learn about. We are releasing a report right after this session on expandingequity.com that talks about the case studies of these 100 companies and what they've learned, the practices that they put in place, and what they hope to achieve.
Let's dig in a little more on that leadership one, because I loved it because it was what Francine talked about as well, as sort of it has to come from the top. What I love about Davos is you assemble rooms like this. These are very often leaders of companies or people who think they're leading the companies or will soon lead the companies, which is great. So what is like the practical advice that you can give them from these learnings?
The practical advice is you must know why you're doing it, and you must engage across your corporation so that others understand the why also. Your value proposition is extremely important. The question that we often pose in our core training is, what happens if you don't? What do you lose out on? What missed opportunities are there? And so we often tell folks, when you're trying to build that capacity and the champions internally, always ask the why. Think about the risk proposition, and then think about what your competitors are doing in that space. Do you want to be at the forefront of that, or do you want to always be catching up? And so we tell folks, it's okay to be uncertain. Everyone's uncertain, but understand what's important to your company, understand what's important to the people that help you achieve the goals of your company, and ask the questions constantly. Why are we doing this? What are we learning? How is it improving? Collect your data. If you will never be able to answer the why question without the data. And you need to use that data on a regular basis, update it on a regular basis, because it will be the motivating factor that you need, and it helps you tell the story and make the case.
So I think that's great advice for leaders and how to lead. What I also love to do when we're talking here is maybe give a call to action. What Davos is great about is collecting people from all over the earth. Then we send them home, back to their companies, back to their countries, back to their governments. What can they go and radiate out when they go back to continue to be a force for good?
If you've never asked the question, start with that. What is it that your employees want to see within your corporation? Ask your leadership, what do we want to be in the sector that we represent? How do we want to be on the leading edge? And when you begin asking those questions and you create an open and transparent and an honest engagement, folks will tell you the truth. And those nuggets are what you begin to build your strategy on.
It's like not being reactive to
No.
this. Be active. Go back to those
You
organizations
have to be
and
proactive.
talk about this.
When you're reactive, you missed all the subtle nuances. But if you're proactive and you're creating the time and the space for the conversation, you actually get the footprint of what you need to do.
This is a tremendous roadmap for people to take on
Absolutely.
with them. Before we get the hook, we're going to end on one fun thing at Axios. We make it one Davos thing here. As you mentioned, first time. How's it going? What are your big hot takes so far?
So my number one hot take is that no one told me that I needed to train for Davos. But in all seriousness, it's been a wonderful opportunity for us. It's our first time at the Kellog Foundation being at Davos. There are 4 of us here. We have 55 engagements over the time that we're here, and we're maximizing it because we believe that it's so important to tell this message and so important to build other champions, and most importantly, for folks to see the Kellogg Foundation as a resource. And so I've enjoyed my Davos experience. I've met every single one of my walking goals this week. And then some, so I have credit for at least a month. And then, we're looking forward to more opportunity to engage and have conversations that are going to be meaningful.
That's awesome. Carla, thanks for being here.
You're
Thanks
most
for being in
welcome.
Davos. Hope to see you again. And thanks to W.K. Kellogg Foundation for making this conversation possible. Stick around. We got one more conversation. I'll welcome Nyla Budu, the host of Axios One Big Thing, up to the main stage.
Good morning, everyone. This is such a great room. Thanks for coming out for us this morning. I am the host of Axios' new podcast, One Big Thing. It's an interview show. Our new episode will be out tomorrow morning. We publish 5:30 New York time, and for those of you who love interview podcasts, it's in smart brevity, so it's 20 minutes. Carla just teed this up perfectly because she was just talking about data, which is why I'm so excited to welcome our next guest, MSNBC and NBC News anchor Richard Louie. Come up here, Richard. Thank you for being here. And I mentioned those two titles.
Yes.
You have a bunch of other ones, and including filmmaker. But I want to start with Priska.
Sure.
Your not-for-profit media company, because
Yeah.
you all have a report that's just out this morning that everyone in this room gets the executive summary of.
Yeah.
And it's really looking at executive leadership in Silicon Valley
That's right.
and diversity. And I want to start with your approach because you all did this as a third-party organization.
Right.
And so let's get straight into it. Like, what does a third-party organization have access to? And in particular,
Right.
like asking the really hard questions like, is my company going to get sued because of DEI?
Yes. Good morning, Axios. Good morning to everybody here at the house, here in Davos. And yes, I think the issue that a lot of board directors face, and this is really where this is focused, is how do you open up this conversation and what is new? And so the way we approached it was to say, well, the common response we get is we have an internal study. We all understand the difficulties of internal studies. That's a great first step. But when it comes down to making the difficult director level conversations and decisions, you need very different sort of actionable data. And so our approach was to get in to ask the questions that CEOs don't want to ask. So how many lawsuits might happen in your organization because of the way that your employees were treated, because of their identity or background?
Tell us the answer of what you found.
In our Silicon Valley report, which you have the executive summary somewhere on your seats, 38% of black workers say yes, they have discussed or thought about a lawsuit because of that treatment. That, I know, for any board director is an absolute eye-opener. Now, the difference about that, Nyla, is if you ask any of those workers of color in Silicon Valley, they will say, that number's kind of low. They will say that.
Wow.
If you talk to a board director, they'll go, that number is about 10x where we even
Where
think
they
it might
thought.
be. Right. And so the beauty of third party is we still ask first party questions. And by asking first party questions, and how are we able to do that? We blended 4 disciplines: business, we also academia, journalism, and then community. All 4 of those disciplines together, you get better questions asked. You know, as you all sit with your organizations, a lot of the data you got has been the same data over and over again. These questions are a little bit more biting, as you brought up, and we get into more of some of the interesting ones like revenue.
Right. So let's talk about revenue and actual cost, right?
Yes.
So what do issues around diversity, equity, or inclusion actually cost companies in the short or long term?
Well, we got right down to it because if you're the champion of inclusion in the board conversation, you do need a new narrative. And so one of the new narratives that we thought about that you might be able to go into to broach this conversation is exactly that. So in organizations where it is felt that racial issues are okay or good, have the opportunity not to lose 10% of revenue. So let me put it the other way around, because that's the way we ask the questions. So sorry for giving you all the detail. Bottom line is there's a 10% percentage point opportunity if you are running an organization where racial issues are not a problem. That's 10%. Even if we're off by a factor of 50%, all of you get, you get 1 or 2 percentage points on top line, you're smiling all the way down the promenade.
So can I ask you just sort of the hard question about this?
Sure.
Do you feel like there is a sense, particularly if we're thinking about Silicon Valley companies,
Yep.
that all of these things like lawsuits, et cetera, are just kind of part of the cost of doing business? Just to be brutal, like.
It can be for some, but I'll be very straight. If you've got 1 in 3, more than 1 in 3, in this case, we're talking about 4 in 10 potentially, you do not have enough. Number one, if you're sitting on the board, your fiduciary responsibility and your risk appetite at that level, again, even if we're off by half, you're not going to be able to function. I mean, can you imagine sitting there in budget time, how much we're going to give to the Human Resources Department, if it's the Human Resources Department?
Right. What about gender equity, especially when it comes to women of color?
Yeah.
What did your risk assessment show?
So this is the double doozy. If you are a worker of color in the Silicon Valley report, I've already described one of the gaps. And if you're a woman, you also face a very similar, so the numbers, by the way, about lawsuits are slightly lower for women, 3 in 10, as opposed to the 4 in 10. But if you add woman plus of color, that is where the math doesn't add up, or it does. It's not 1 and 1, it's 1 plus 1 equals 3. So that is, I think, one of the discoveries we didn't want to find. That was one of the hypotheses we went out with. The data shows you already feel disadvantaged or actually disadvantaged as a woman in Silicon Valley, and you're as a person of color as well. But you add those two together, and you get 1 plus 1 equals 3. And no matter how we looked at the data, because we spent 2 years. Anybody who loves regressions in here? Yeah, so we love regressions, and if you have that, it's on page 12. You can take a look at it. You can sing them up and down the promenade. I got a regression. And those regressions are so eye-opening. They're very straightforward. If you do X, you get Y. And so when it comes to women and women of color especially, that is what I think we're not quite understanding, either in the gender equity conversation within corporations or just within the conversation itself academically.
So let's talk about, before we get to more solutions, as you think about, is there anything else that you want to highlight in the report that you think this room needs to know?
Yeah, I think if you take a look at the report, it is based on asking questions that you don't want to ask, but number two, it also lays out action-based strategies. We have a lot of what's wrong, and we need to figure out how do we get past the wrong. And so we spent a lot of time looking at community. We went out to communities. We spoke to hundreds of DEI practitioners, many of which, and I'll only say this, we need to figure out how to increase their tenure. On average, Fortune 5 down to Fortune 1000 that I've spoken with, they have an average tenureship of 1-2 years, maybe. So how do we equip them to stay longer, succeed longer? That, I think, is something that those action-based strategies, and because I went to Michigan, where we're very focused on operationalization. Anybody can say go blue.
I was waiting for someone to say go blue.
Sorry. For all our non-North American friends, I apologize. I really do.
You cannot get away from Michigan no matter where you go.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, there you go. I love you all. I love this already. But it's about bootstrapping and getting it done. That's why I bring up Michigan. So that's, I think, where we can go.
This is the big question, though, right?
Yeah.
Because then the elephant in the room is, how are you equipping those people when DEI efforts, particularly in the United States,
Yes.
are not just coming under, it's not just part of sort of in the crosshairs
Yeah.
of a cultural conversation, but a legal conversation
Yeah.
of saying maybe legally this is not a strategy companies should be pursuing.
Yeah. That is the question all the time, and I think the way you're going to get past that polarization that we see in many different sectors is to find the common vernacular. I think we're in that time where we've watched words evolve. If you just look about the inclusion journey, what is the word you use when you want to bring it up to the board? What is the word you use? Do you use diversity? Do you use DEI? Do you use inclusion? I was mentioning this earlier when we were launching this very risk report with Ryan Heath earlier today in Davos, and I said, multicultural is the word I've been hearing lately. That's like going back to the 70s. I mean, that's 70s. But the deal is we're looking for terms that we can at least come together on this topic because we're very aware of, without getting into the detail too much, unless you want to, how we've come to this sort of polarized moment about a topic that very clearly is, when we're thinking about our most valuable asset, which we all know in this as practitioners in this room, are our human resources, and we're not addressing it very well, given that that's our major resource.
So let's talk solutions, hiring, retention. What are you hearing? What is part of this research showing in terms of what people need to know?
So what we learned in the last 4 to 5 years is that many of those corporations, at least the ones that I've met and I've discussed or gone to speak at, are those that have invested in their communities. They're starting to learn more because they can't just go to their BRG or their ERG, whatever your human resource group is that you've created for certain groups. Those are super helpful, which I'll get to in a moment. But those who have decided to actually invest with their own hands in the community-based organizations, so to really understand, well, what is this struggle? What is it that I'm actually thinking? So I think that's what I've seen as succeeding. That's one definite area. Second of all, do you move your ERG into a BRG?
Yeah, tell us about that.
So an employee resource
What's
group.
the difference between an ERG and a BRG?
And again, there will be a lot of people that will argue what the differences are, but commonly what I've found is employee resource group is it's a community space. So you have an ERG for caregivers, for instance, where caregivers can talk to each other, talk about their careers, what they're challenged with, right? They may be taking care of a child with disabilities. You move into a BRG, and that's when the board and or executive leadership says, hey, as the leader of the BRG, how do you think we can serve that community better? Mm-hmm. Now, that's a different conversation because then this is another thing that corporations can consider is do you compensate those leaders of those employee resource groups or business resource groups for the very information that they're helping with the company to increase revenue? Because they're your mini a strategy group, right? They're the ones that's thinking through it. So that's another thing that corporations and businesses can do is think about how do you compensate for that effort and that knowledge.
So we just have a few minutes left,
Sure.
and I want to get to two more things here. I feel like I cannot be on stage without you, without saying that you and I are both longtime members of the Asian American Journalists Association. We go a long way back with that organization, which has worked really hard to
Yes.
provide for equity and representation in newsrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any findings in this study that you think are also applicable to the media industry? Like, what do you think is the big takeaway here?
Well, I think the big debate in the media industry is just because I look this way, does that mean, therefore, that I would understand where I'm coming from, where I have that perspective? More often than not, the answer is yes. And if you can apply that over the corporate side, and as a former city banker and a former fintech guy, I would say from remembering those days when I worked in those spaces, the answer is yes. But it is much more important when we put people on stage that might reflect either your company's values and or the stakeholders that your company is involved in. And so stakeholder capitalism is a very important, I think, opportunity for us to discuss. This is only one part of that very idea of stakeholder capitalism. And when we walk away from our conversations from Davos, is to re-explore how we can redefine stakeholder capitalism, because this is what this is about.
I don't want to let you go without asking about one other thing that I know is near and dear to your heart when we talk about diversity and inclusion, and that's around caregiving.
Yes.
What do you think? I just want to sort of leave some space to talk about that.
Yeah.
And where that fits into all of this.
Because this is all part of our teams. No matter what organizations we're in, is about how do we find spaces for everybody to be included. We happen to be focusing in this report on different workers of color. The inclusion spaces also include those who are caregivers. It includes our military communities. It actually includes our religious communities too. So there's all sorts of other communities we can talk about when we're considering inclusion. I think that when it comes to caregiving, what I've seen as a great example is Meta, my good friend Shauna Sweeney, started what is now their largest ERG, BRG, just about. They have 4,000 members in their caregiving ERG. And this is the point. Did you know that in the United States alone, 5 million children are family caregivers, unpaid, untrained, taking care of a loved one? There are 25 million that are millennial and younger, unpaid and untrained. And we're talking about $500 billion in unrealized value a year. So the McKinsey report on caregiving, if you want to go look at a resource, is great. Came out 3 to 5 years ago. It's a fantastic opportunity to broaden the conversation of inclusion. Because if any of you are caregivers or have been involved in that, it is the one activity in the inclusionary space where all the walls start to melt away.
Yeah. Well, that's a great. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank you for being here with us. I want to thank all of you in the room for being with us as well.